I will never forget what he did to me that night. So intense, so utterly forbidden. And yet, in that moment, it felt like the only thing that had ever truly mattered. It's strange how one decision, one encounter, can change everything. The man who could shatter humanity's future sat waiting for me, and I was walking straight into his den. When I accepted this assignment, I thought I understood the risks. Earth had spent decades preparing for contact with the Xerathi Empire, a civilization as advanced as it was elusive. Their technology outstripped ours by centuries. Their empire spanned galaxies, and their emperor. He was a figure cloaked in both mystery and terror. Kaelor. Even his name carried weight, whispered in cautionary tales of battles lost to the Xerathi and alliances shattered under the weight of his ruthless precision. He was the architect of galactic domination, the unyielding force that Earth now sought as an ally. And for reasons I still didn't fully understand, the Galactic Alliance had chosen me to negotiate with him. It wasn't just humanity's first official contact with the Xerathi. It was also likely our last chance for peace. If I failed, war was inevitable. As our transport began its descent onto Xerathis, the weight of that responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. The view of the planet from orbit had been breathtaking, but nothing could compare to the surreal beauty that greeted us as we broke through the atmosphere. The sky was alive with golden storms, lightning weaving through clouds like molten veins. Below, crystalline spires reached toward the heavens, their smooth surfaces refracting light in brilliant, kaleidoscopic displays. Between them sprawled bioluminescent forests, their faint glow painting the landscape in hues of blue and green. "Ambassador Callan, we'll be landing shortly," the pilot announced over the comms. I nodded, forcing myself to breathe. There was no room for hesitation now. I was Earth's voice, tasked with convincing an empire that humanity deserved a seat at the table. But the reports I'd read on Kaelor lingered in my mind like a warning. A leader unparalleled in intelligence and strategy, a man who valued power above all else. And yet, some accounts hinted at something deeper, an enigma, a ruler who defied easy categorization. I would soon find out which version was true. The transport touched down with a low hum, and I stepped onto Xerathis soil for the first time. A delegation of Xerathi nobles awaited, their tall, silvery forms glinting under the faint light of their world. They regarded me with cold curiosity, their expressions unreadable. At the head of the group was a figure I recognized instantly, though I had only seen him in images. Kaelor's steward, a towering Xerathi with sharp, angular features and piercing white eyes. "This way," he said, his voice smooth but commanding. I followed him into the heart of the Emperor's palace, a sprawling structure of obsidian and light. The halls were impossibly vast, their walls lined with intricate carvings that shimmered faintly as we passed. It felt less like a building and more like a living entity, pulsing with a quiet, unseen energy. As we approached the throne room, my pulse quickened. I wasn't sure if it was fear, awe, or some unsettling mixture of the two. Then the doors opened, and my world shifted. The throne room was vast, its ceiling lost to shadow and its walls aglow with shifting patterns of light. At its center sat Emperor Kaelor. He was nothing like I had imagined, and yet somehow exactly what I had feared. Kaelor's presence was magnetic, his tall, broad frame exuding a quiet authority. His silvery skin shimmered faintly under the golden light, and his golden eyes seemed to pierce straight through me, as if he could see every thought I had ever had. For a moment, I couldn't move. It wasn't just his appearance. It was the sheer weight of his presence. "You're younger than I expected, Ambassador Callan," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the room. I straightened, forcing my voice to steady. "And you're more direct than I anticipated, Your Majesty." A faint smile tugged at his lips, though his gaze remained unyielding. "This should be interesting." I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. Every encounter with Kalor felt like stepping into a sparring ring. His sharp mind was a blade, cutting cleanly through the defenses I had spent hours constructing, leaving me both frustrated and strangely exhilarated. Yet, hidden between his incisive remarks, there were cracks in his armor, moments when his tone softened, and I caught a glimpse of something far more human beneath the Emperor's imposing exterior. One such moment came late one evening, after the tension of hours spent locked in heated discussion. As we walked through the palace gardens, the world around us seemed to hold its breath. The bioluminescent plants glowed faintly, their light spilling onto the stone pathways like liquid moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of alien blossoms, sweet and heady, wrapping around me as if the planet itself was conspiring to unsettle me. "You speak of unity," Kalor said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a quiet storm. His gaze stayed fixed ahead, watching the glowing path as though it might provide answers. "But your species thrives on division. Why should I believe humanity can uphold an alliance it doesn't even uphold within itself?" The question was pointed, a deliberate jab, but it carried a weight that struck deeper than his usual barbs. My steps faltered as his words pressed into the unspoken fears I carried, the ones I worked so hard to keep buried. "Because unity isn't about perfection," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "It's about trying. It's about making the choice to work for something greater, even when it's difficult." Kalor stopped walking. Slowly, deliberately, he turned to face me. The golden light of his eyes, usually fierce and calculating, seemed to flicker with something unfamiliar. A glimmer of curiosity, perhaps, or something far more dangerous. It was as though he was seeing me for the first time, not as a diplomat or a human, but as me. "You surprise me, Arya," he said, my name rolling off his tongue with a weight that felt almost intimate, as though he had claimed it for himself. The way he spoke it, low, deliberate and laced with something unspoken, sent a shiver down my spine, not unlike the chill of a sudden storm breaking through the heat. I should have looked away, should have pushed the moment aside and returned to the safety of formality. But his gaze held me captive, and for a fleeting second, I let myself wonder what it might feel like to step even closer to the edge of the storm. Weeks slipped by, each day a delicate dance on the knife's edge of diplomacy. The council's patience wore thin, their divided whispers echoing through the palace halls. Isolationists clung to fear, while others saw a glimmer of hope in the fragile threads of our negotiation. But amidst the tension and politics, my thoughts were consumed by something far more dangerous. Him. Kalor had become an enigma I couldn't unravel. He was the storm and the calm, the razor's edge of intellect and a subtle pull that unsettled the very foundation of my resolve. The first time I caught him watching me, I brushed it off as strategy, a predator studying his prey. But when it happened again, and yet again, the weight of his gaze lingered like a phantom touch, leaving me restless long after he had turned away. "You're distracted, Ambassador," he said during a particularly fraught meeting, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. I met his gaze, my cheeks flushing under the intensity of his scrutiny. "And you're infuriating," I countered, my tone sharp, though the quickened beat of my heart betrayed me. Kalor leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. His golden eyes gleamed, catching the light like molten metal. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "we're more alike than you think." The words hung in the air, weaving between us like an invisible thread. I wanted to snap back, to break whatever spell he was casting, but my pulse quickened at the thought of what he might truly mean. His smirk deepened, as if he could hear the unspoken questions unraveling inside me. I could feel the heat of his presence, even from across the table, like the faint crackle of static before a lightning strike. The meeting resumed, the council members returning to their debates, but I barely heard them. My thoughts were caught in the charged space between us, a space I knew I had no business lingering in, but couldn't seem to leave. The golden storms raged outside, their thunder rolling through the palace like a symphony of chaos. The air in the hallways had felt heavy as I made my way to Kaylor's private chambers, each step sinking deeper into an anticipation I couldn't fully understand or deny. The doors slid open, revealing a room bathed in dim, flickering light. The crystalline walls shimmered like liquid stars, casting shifting patterns across the floor. It felt like stepping into another world, one that held its own pulse, its own secrets. Kaylor stood by the window, his silhouette etched against the storm-lit sky. His shoulders, usually held with rigid command, were tense, almost weary. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should disturb whatever thoughts kept him so still. When he finally turned to face me, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. His expression was unguarded, his golden eyes carrying an intensity that stripped me of my defenses. He looked less like the unyielding emperor I had come to know, and more like a man fighting something he could no longer control.
"I shouldn't have called you here,"
he said, his voice rough and low, like the distant growl of thunder. "Then why did you?" I asked, my own voice barely above a whisper as I stepped further into the room. His gaze met mine, and the weight of it rooted me in place. "Because," he said, the word catching in his throat before it broke free, "I can't stop thinking about you." The admission hit me like a physical force, leaving me breathless. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a warning and a temptation all at once. "Kaylor," I began, but the words faltered. He took a step closer, then another, the space between us dissolving with each measured movement. The storm outside seemed to quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. "This is wrong," I whispered, even as my pulse quickened and the pull between us grew impossible to resist. "Then tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice a rough whisper, tinged with something raw and desperate. But I didn't. He closed the distance between us, his golden eyes locking onto mine until the last moment, when his lips finally met mine. The kiss was soft at first, cautious, as though testing the boundary we were about to cross. But when I didn't pull away, his restraint melted into something deeper, something undeniable. The kiss deepened, warm and consuming, like the storm outside had found its reflection in us. His hands moved to my waist, steady and sure, pulling me closer until there was nothing between us but the unspoken emotions we'd both tried to deny. His hands lingered as though memorizing the moment, his touch gentle, yet deliberate. When his fingers brushed along my arm and down to my waist, it sent a quiet warmth through me, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. He guided me toward the edge of the bed, the world outside these walls fading into irrelevance. The air around us felt charged, alive with the tension and tenderness of a moment we couldn't resist. As we sank into the soft folds of the sheets, I was acutely aware of the hum of energy in him, a quiet power that seemed to resonate through his touch. My hands rested on his chest, feeling the cool, smooth surface of his skin, a reminder of how different we were, and yet how inevitable this felt. There was no hesitation, no need for words, only the quiet understanding that we had already crossed a line far deeper than the one before us now. He rested his forehead against mine, his golden eyes holding mine for a moment that felt like eternity. Slowly, deliberately, the space between us disappeared entirely, and we became something more than ourselves. The night passed in a blur of closeness and quiet intensity, every touch speaking volumes of what we couldn't say aloud. By the time the storm outside had stilled, we lay together in the dim light, his hand tracing soft, absent patterns along my arm. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with the weight of everything that had just changed. Once wasn't enough. Twice wasn't either. By the time the storm outside finally calmed, we had found each other again and again, unable to stop, unable to let go. For that moment, the rest of the galaxy disappeared. The fragile alliance, the council's whispers, the weight of our roles, all of it faded into nothing. There was only him, only us, and the storm that raged both outside and within. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. His golden eyes searched mine, and for the first time I saw a vulnerability in them that mirrored my own. "This changes everything," he said softly, his voice trembling just enough to betray the gravity of what we'd done. I nodded, my heart still racing. "I know." And yet, in that moment, I didn't care. The next morning, I stood at the balcony of my chambers, staring out at the golden horizon as the remnants of the storm faded into calm. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, the golden light casting a surreal glow over the city below. My thoughts were anything but calm. I replayed every detail of the night before in my mind, the way his hands had felt against my skin, the intensity in his golden eyes, the way he'd whispered my name as though it were sacred. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, as if we had both been pulled into something far greater than ourselves, something neither of us could resist. And yet, as intoxicating as it had been, the lines we crossed now loomed like shadows over the fragile peace we were trying to build. Kaylor's words echoed in my mind, quiet but heavy with truth. "You're tearing apart everything I've built." He hadn't meant just his empire. He had meant himself. I knew that now. The weight of what we'd done settled over me like a stone. I had felt alive in his arms, more alive than I had in years. But at what cost? The man who had held me so gently, so reverently, was the same man who could unravel humanity's future with a single decision. And I had given in to something that felt bigger than logic, bigger than duty. A part of me wanted to regret it. It would have been easier if I could. But I couldn't. Not when every memory of the night before lit a fire in my chest that I didn't know how to extinguish. When we met again in the council chamber, the room was filled with the usual murmur of debates and posturing. Kaylor's expression was unreadable, his face as still and imperious as ever. But when our eyes met across the table, something flickered, brief but unmistakable. It was a look that said he remembered every moment, every word, every breath we had shared. It was a look that told me he felt it too, the thrill, the guilt, the impossibility of it all. I turned my gaze back to the documents before me, forcing myself to focus, but my hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edge of the table. I could feel him watching me, the weight of his presence pressing against my composure. We had crossed a boundary we could never uncross. And now, the question lingered like a storm on the horizon. Could we hold together the fragile threads of peace we were trying to weave? Or had we already begun to tear them apart?